Hello and welcome to today's webinar hosted by Rails to Trails Conservancy's Trail Expert Network. My name is Mary Ellen Kuntz and I'm the Manager of Trail Resources here at RTC. Our topic for today is trail use trends, leveraging data to make the case for trails. Before I hand it off to Eric, let's take a quick survey. Question 1, do you have counters deployed on your trail? Please select yes or no. Okay, it looks like 55% of you said yes and 45% said no. Our next question is, if you don't have counters, why not? Is it a lack of funding? They aren't a priority right now. You couldn't make the case for it, or felt visual counts were sufficient. Interesting. 54% of respondents said it's a lack of funding, 39% said that it's just not a priority right now, and 19% said you couldn't make a case for it. I believe we'll be covering all of these potential options over the course of the webinar. Our last question is, if you have counters in place, how do you use the data, or how would you like to use the collected data? To help make the case for trail expansion, to help defend or increase trail budgets, or to help with operations, maintenance, and ongoing programming decisions. So 57% said you use it to make the case for trail expansion, 64% said you can defend or increase trail budgets, and 71% said to help with operations, maintenance, and programming. With that, I'll turn it off to Eric.
Thank you very much, Mary Ellen, and thank you all for joining us today. Again, I'm Eric Oberg. I'm the Midwest Regional Director at Rails to Trails Conservancy. I would like to remind you, if you have questions for our panelists, the chat function on the control panel of the GoToWebinar, please put your questions in there. Thank you to those of you who sent questions in ahead of time. There were some fabulous questions that came in ahead of time that we will get to a few of those as well. But you didn't come here to listen to me today. Let me introduce this wonderful, distinguished panel. Torsha Bhattacharya is the Director of Research here at Rails to Trails Conservancy. We've got Wade Johnston, who is the Director of Tri-State Trails at the Green Umbrella in Cincinnati, Ohio. And Sherry Ryan, the Professor of City Planning at San Diego State University School of Public Affairs. And we will be going in that order today, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Torsha.
Okay, thank you so much, Eric. Hello, everyone. Today I am going to talk about the counting program and the monitoring system that we have over at Rails to Trails Conservancy. I will focus my presentation on why we count, what kind of studies we have done so far, and especially touch a little bit on how COVID and this one of a scenario that we are in, how counts have been helping us to make a point about the importance of trails in people's lives. Next slide. Okay, why should we count? Well, the one and only reason, I guess, if you don't count trails, then trails won't matter. Trails will not get the funding it requires. It'll be hard for us to gather support for trails. And just like with all kinds of vehicle traffic, like truck, cars, we need the numbers to make the case that people are actually on trails, people are using it for multiple purposes. Otherwise, it's just anecdotal evidence that we have without any supportive or quantitative data. And sometimes to make the case to your local elected leaders, you need that scientific, that number to help strengthen your case. A lot of the times you'll also be working to support your funding applications, to actually calculate health benefits or economic impact of trails. And for all of those multiplier benefits, your count number is very, very important, because once you have the count number, you can always use it as a multiplier for per person benefit, whether it's environmental benefits, economic benefits, or be it the health benefits that you can think of. In terms of process that you will be looking at when you think of setting up a monitoring process is, first of all, what type of mode are you looking to monitor and why? So it's always important to ask yourself why you are counting. what help it will it get, and also getting to the bigger story of what message do you want to convey to whoever your stakeholders are, whether it's decision makers, support groups, or just your everyday users. What kind of story do you want to tell them? Because again, at the end of the day, you have to remember that these are just count. These are numbers. The story weaving part is on you. So you need to know a lot more about your trails. So first, determine the mode of traffic, whether just bike or ped, you want a separation between the two, or you just need a combined number, what works best for your case. The second thing is another very crucial aspect is looking at where to put these counters. Most of the time, you will look at travel patterns, traffic patterns, and look at places where most of the foot traffic is. So you want to gauge that, but it will also give you a skewed count if you only put it at the maximum traveled areas. So if you are lucky enough to have the funding for multiple trail counters, make sure you space them apart in a certain way so that it gives you an idea about how people are using it and what stretches of the trail are more used than others. And then you can answer those interesting questions about why is this trail section more used as opposed to the other section. So getting to those questions require a little more in-depth reviewing of that. And so if you have multiple counters in this whole network of trails, it gives you a holistic picture. What kind of devices do you want to put in? Do you want to put in an automatic counter? If you don't have the money for that, do you want to just send in people to do daily counts? And then Rails to Trails actually has a tool where you can put in hourly counts and it will spit out the average annual daily traffic, whether it's pedestrians or bicyclists. So you can use that if you don't have enough funding for it, or if you have some few counters, you can even think of rotating them yearly or biannually, depending on what kind of traffic you're trying to look at. The best is, though, having multiple years of counting in a specific place, permanent counters, so you get a range of movement and trends. Also, the other important thing to keep in mind is to follow the recommended practice that have been laid down for monitoring vehicle, foot, as well as bike traffic. And then once you have those numbers, it's also very, very crucial to look at them with a critical eye, because there will be, and I can promise you that there will be outliers. Maybe somebody would have messed with the counters, maybe a bird would have made a nest in the counters, or the batteries will have been messed up due to water getting in there. So there could be umpteenth reason why your numbers one day shows 2,000 people, the next day might show 40,000 people. So look out for these outliers that don't make sense. And then it's on you to do the QCing of the reporting of the data before you report out and make it accessible to the public. Next slide. Okay, so as I quickly mentioned about the different types of counters, now RTC has access to about 50 counters. Nationally, we gather data from different partners, and we have a few counters around there. And that gives us a very good snapshot of what the trends are, usually along these trails. But that by no means is a reflection of what's happening everywhere, just a sampling. The technology that we have used and the counters that we use is inductive loops, and we get mostly from permanent counters, and the company that we use is EcoCounters. But there are several other companies, several other types of technologies like pneumatic tubes, mostly used for temporary short duration counts, which you can then move from place to place. Then also there is the infrared sensors, and that's what they use the infrared to make a distinction between the modes. So depending on how much money, capital, time, and labor you have available on your end, you can decide. It's not a one size fits all. Some people start small. If you are in charge of just one trail, putting putting one counter at a time. But then some people who are in charge of a trail network, they will start off, it's better to start off with at least 10 or 15. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to give you a brief snapshot of what a trail count program might look like and what you can do with that, the kind of data that you will see or the patterns you might see over time. And this one is in our Industrial Heartlands Trail Coalition. What we did was put in counters in several locations, but we divided all of these locations into 5 specific categories. One was forest. So again, the type of usage would be different there. One was rural, suburban, urban, the 3 usual demarcations that we have for land use there, and then parks. So parks and forests we knew would show a different type of usage than maybe the urban, rural, and the suburban land use that we looked at. A total of 30 sites, and we had about 6 counters within each of those categories that I just mentioned. Next slide. Yep. So what you see mostly here is the different trends over time. You get a normal pattern of average daily trail traffic, but there are some outliers in some trails that you can see in the forest, the number 28 that's marked. You can see that there are suburban counters, which was 0, nothing happened, and then boom, it went up all of a sudden. There was missing days where the counter did not collect data for whatever reason. But again, if you see at the top corner of it, which says a normal suburban pattern, that is your expected pattern in one of the sites. So again, you need to look at it right even before you start analyzing it. You need to have a testing period to see whether your data is coming in properly, if you can interpret the data, if there are outliers, going back and resetting it, and then getting the QC data to do any kind of analysis. Otherwise, it's going to be a GIGO model, garbage in, garbage out. So you want to put good data in to get good analysis out of it. Next one. Okay, so in terms of analyzing patterns, you can do it by land use, like you can see here, urban, suburban, all the 6 different categories, they showed very different different patterns of usage. But the other thing you can also do is look at usage as it varies between weekdays and weekends, or daytime traffic, morning or nighttime traffic. You can look at peaks, whether there's a PM peak and AM peak, or it is a sustained use during the evening. Given all of these different types of information, again, all of these are coming from those data points, but if you look at the pattern over time, it will tell you a story. Is it mostly a utilitarian usage trail where people are using to go back and forth to their work? Or is it a recreational trail where mostly people are going there after work on weekends to do that? Is it something that is very weather dependent? You can look at, again, you can put in all of the rainy days that just side by side and look at how the weather pattern has changed. Or is it something that is very hilly, high slope, and therefore might actually prevent some of the people from using it, specifically when you're looking at trail segments. So once you look at these micro level geographies and look at micro level timings, you start to kind of get to the stories that each of these numbers can tell you. Next slide. Okay, so what are the few things you need to make sure you have in mind? First of all, what kind of trail you're using. An urban trail will look very different than a suburban, and similarly the rural will look, again, a lot more different. What kind of factoring system do you have, or do you have any factoring system when you're looking at the numbers, the trail traffic in general? What kind of location have you used to monitor? And if you think that it's not the perfect location, it's best for you to move it to a different location. So please make sure that you have that option in place, that it's not just set in stone once done. in this study, we kind of suggested that for a forest trail that maybe it's okay to use one trail counter every 5 miles, but then as the density of population increases, your length between or distance between two traffic counters should decrease. What that is will basically be guided by how many counters you have available, but as a rule of thumb, the more dense it is, the more granular you want to go with your placements. The less it is, the more long distance travel takes place, and having it fewer and farther between makes sense. It'll still give you a good enough picture. Next slide. Okay, so like I mentioned in the previous chart when we were talking about different land use, you see it might be a little hard to read, but what we see here is a very typical weekday versus weekend, morning versus noon ratio of usage. And with that, it helped us understand what kind of usage each of those trails were seeing in the IHTC network. Some were mixed use, some were mostly utilitarian, and others were basically recreational usage. But we have to keep in mind that when you're trying to make the case for trails, it really is immaterial where people are using it for exercise or for going to work, because they're getting the same amount of exercise doing that, especially when it comes to health calculation. We keep tossing around, no, this is a utilitarian trail, this is a recreational trail. Well, as long as the people are on there, they are getting the same benefits. Doesn't matter whether they're going to work or using it just for their 30 minutes of recommended activity. So that needs to be also kept in mind, the bigger picture when you're trying to make the case. Next slide. Okay, so this gives you a snapshot of the EcoCounters that RTC has in Pennsylvania. That's a lot of counters. We have about 22 DCNR funded counters, and they have been in place for multiple years now. What it has allowed us to do is to get real-time information, almost real-time, I would say. You always tend to harvest the data at the end of the day if you need it, or better yet, after a day or two, if there has been some error, to give some time for that QCing process. So what this, if you go onto this link, it actually directly takes you to the public data site for the EcoCounter interface, and you can look at all of the Pennsylvania counters that that Rails Trails has. Next slide. And this one gives you a glimpse of what our national counter system looks like. As I mentioned, we have access to about 50 trail counters overall. Again, Pennsylvania, because they have a statewide counting program, in addition to what the DVRPC or the Delaware Valley Planning Council has, the state also has a separate one, very robust counting program. There are other states that have similar programs, but we don't have access to some of the data. So we are working towards creating some kind of a national clearinghouse or database where it'll be easier for people to come in, look at the national data that is available, and then help make the case or tell the stories. But that's some way off. So we are just trying to build the relationships so that it might be possible. And this is kind of a call out to anybody in the audience today who would like to share information or link up to our national counter program to share their data. It would be great. Just reach out to any of us using the email. But so far, we have a very robust data collection from the trail counters. And next slide. What it has allowed us to do is show the impact that COVID, the pandemic, people stuck at home, has had year over year on and nationally for trail counts. A lot of people, we have suddenly realized that there is this recognition that trails are important, outdoor space is important for mental and physical health, and people are going out in droves to do that safely, hopefully. But starting the count now would actually not give you as much information or insight because you don't have anything to compare it with. So while an incident happens, it's already too late to see a before and after scenario. Now, the trails that had the counters already in place, they're the only ones who from which we can use the data to do this comparison. There are a lot more trails that have come online recently. Unfortunately, the comparison is not possible. So the depth of information and the value of the numbers that you get is lost. So, but I would say better late than never. Start counting now before it's late. Who knows what happens? I'm not saying something will happen, but start counting before you need the data, before you actually have to make the case, because you need to build up to that. You need to show your change in usage over time. Next slide.
We're gonna have to move on to Wade. I'm sorry, Torsha.
Yeah, no, sorry. I was done, and if you have any questions, just email me. Sorry.
No, great. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. We're gonna go to the Green Umbrella in Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky, and Southeast Indiana. Wade Johnston.
Thanks, Eric. Hey, so I am Wade Johnston. I'm the Director of Tri-State Trails at Green Umbrella. Next slide, please. Green Umbrella is a regional sustainability alliance based out of Greater Cincinnati, Ohio. And the program that I lead is specifically focused on connecting and expanding our regional trail and bikeway network. So one of the pillars of our work is collecting data and maintaining data on trail use so that we're able to use that to leverage investment in trails. Next slide. So we set up our trail counting program in 2017. This was in partnership with our primary funder at the time, Interact for Health. Interact for Health had invested quite a bit of funding into our program and into many trail initiatives locally, and they wanted to understand what their investment, how their investment was paying off. Were people using trails more frequently as a result of their investment? And so we set up this regional program. There were a couple partners that were already counting in our region. And so we integrated that data into this regional outlook. And the way that we do that, like Torsha was explaining, we have a series of permanent counting sites, and then we do a series of short duration sites, short duration counts throughout the year to generate these two metrics, average annual daily trail traffic and trail miles traveled. Next slide. So like with any program, it's really important to understand what you want to monitor and accomplish in collecting this data. So we set out some goals at the beginning. The first was to collect a baseline of data to understand where we're starting from and be able to monitor that over time and see how trail use evolves. We also wanted to set up a standard methodology that had regional buy-in so that everyone was working from the same template, so to speak. And the data that we're collecting, ultimately, we want to be useful for our trail partners to be able to use in grant applications or in funding requests so that they can leverage investment to do capital investments or maintain their trail. Next slide. So we had a number of partners at the table for this. The Friends of the Little Miami State Park were probably the best established counting program already in our region. They were monitoring about 50 miles of trail where they had set up a very systematic program for their trail monitoring. Great Parks of Hamilton County is a park district that was doing some counts at their park, more like loop trails, but it was useful data for our analysis. And then we partnered with two academic partners, University of Minnesota. Professor Greg Lindsay helped us set up our program, and we modeled it off of the Columbus Impact of Trail study, which he was a consultant on. And now we work with the University of Cincinnati. We've built some capacity here locally to conduct our analysis. And our Metropolitan Planning Organization, OKI Regional Council of Governments, has some counters that they lend us for our program. Next slide. So, we have a pretty large trail network. Not all of it is regional. We've got about 400 miles of trail at this point in 2017. And we knew in our first year we weren't going to be able to collect data at all of these trails. So we had to establish some priorities. Next slide. So we looked at where are our partners already counting. We don't want to duplicate that. We wanted to pull that into what we're doing and leverage that. Next slide. And so then we tried to zoom out and think, because we're a regional organization, we wanted to understand the regional usage of trails. So we pretty much excluded some of the loop trails that were in parks that were shorter, and we focused really on regional linear trail corridors that were around 2 miles in length. And we always look every year when we're reevaluating the locations of our counters about trails that are planned that will be built in the future, so that we're able to have a snapshot of data beforehand, and then after that trail is built, be able to say this is how trail use was impacted once a connection was made. And we're still waiting to see some of those connections be built, but we believe that it's going to be really positive for making the case for investing in a connected network. Next slide, please. So then we set up a plan, a set of goals for where we wanted to do our counts. And we learned that this was much more ambitious than we were able to do in our first year, but we prioritized, and that was a really important part of it. So we were able to hit all of the high priority sites for the first year, which ended up being about 50 short duration counts. And these are 7-day counts that we're conducting between May and October. In the years since then, we have gotten a lot more efficient at the way that we rotate our counters, and we learned a lot during that first year. You learn from your mistakes, and we've gotten better at it. Next slide. We also wanted to make sure that we had regional buy-in on this process. So we have a really robust network of trail managers and planners and local governments, nonprofit groups. And while we have a pretty good understanding of the regional trail network, we know that these partners have a more intimate understanding of the trail that goes through their community. So we got their buy-in to make sure we were locating counters at the right location, so that it wasn't right by a trailhead and skewed by people, getting on and off the trail, but just a little bit off of the trail head, so that we're able to collect that regional trail usage. Next slide, please. And then so this is where we ended up actually being able to do counts in the first year. We got to 51 short duration counts, and we had 10 reference sites. And if you go to the next slide, it'll show you the way that average annual daily trail traffic looked like throughout the region. It's a little hard to see, but zoomed in down at the urban core, at the intersection of all those highways there, that is where our trail use is the highest, right around downtown. There's a bridge that connects Kentucky and Indiana, or Kentucky and Cincinnati, I'm sorry. And that's our most highly used trail in the region, the Purple People Bridge. For the first year, we had an average annual daily trail traffic of 252. So, that ranges depending on what trail you're on. The Purple People Bridge was like 1,900 people a day. We had some rural trails that were 8 people a day. So that's something that we've learned just about how trail use is impacted by land use and the way that people are using the trail. Next slide, please. Then the following year, we got a lot more efficient. We were able to increase the number of miles we were monitoring on. The previous year, we were monitoring about 136 miles. In 2018, we upped that to 187 miles. We conducted 99 short duration counts that year. And the next slide will show you average annual daily trail traffic for that year. What was interesting is that trail use went down a little bit. Our average annual daily trail traffic overall went down from 252 to 216. And we believe that that was primarily because we had kind of a crummy year with weather. The previous year, we had a really mild winter, some really sunny days, nice warm weather in January, and that was reflected in trail use. The following year in 2018, we had a really rainy spring. It rained like the entire March, April, and May, and that impacted trail use. So it's just something that even if the trail use goes down, it's important to have that data to be able to understand why trail use is varying. Next slide. So this is our plan for, this was our plan for last year. We're still in the process of crunching the numbers for our average annual daily trail traffic. Had some delays because of the pandemic and access to graduate students, but we're pretty hopeful based on where we are in the analysis that it's going to be an increase from the previous year. And like I said, every year we're looking at planned trails to make sure that we're collecting data for the following year that is going to be useful to tell that long-term story. Next slide. So here's just a brief snapshot of trail use over time. The trail miles traveled increased from 2017 to 2018. And even though average annual daily trail traffic went down, the trail miles traveled went up because we were monitoring more miles of trail. So that was just not exactly comparing apples to apples in terms of the number of miles that we're comparing. And we're hoping that number goes up again for 2019. Next slide, please. So we also did a trail user intercept survey in 2017. If you go to the next slide, we set up a plan to collect data at 20 different survey sites. For each site, we got 1 weekday and 1 weekend. We did a 3-hour window from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. At all these different sites. And overall, we collected 111 survey hours and 738 responses, which was a statistically valid sample for our trail network. Next slide, please. And so one of the questions that was really interesting was, what is the street intersection nearest your home? So it wasn't asking address, but it was able to give us some information about where people are coming from. And it was good to see that people are coming from all over the place to use the trail. And we'll talk a little bit about demographics here in a second. Next slide. So most people were using the trail for recreation based on the trails that we surveyed and the responses that we collected. We were hoping that more people would be using it for transportation, but that just wasn't the case. And so, you know, the results of this have impacted the way that we have focused our advocacy efforts, so that we are really trying to connect our urban core trail network so that it can be used for more utilitarian purposes. Next slide, please. We had a good split between male and female. Some of the other trail surveys I've seen have shown a higher percentage of males than females, so we were glad to see that both genders feel comfortable using the trail. We had predicted that trail use would be predominantly white, and that was what we found. And you know, we think that that's in many parts a reflection of where the trails are in our community and where we set up our trail survey. We did choose some sites specifically to try to get more diverse responses based on just going to diverse communities, and trail use was much lower on those sites. So you know, when you're choosing to do a survey, you want to get the most bang for your buck, how you're using your time and resources. So we were trying to go to trails that were high traffic, so we would get our statistically valid sample. But nevertheless, this data that we have received about race and ethnicity has impacted the way, again, that we have advocated for our trails and planned our trails. We have really been focusing on urban core and underserved communities to make sure that trail use can be equitable, and that communities, regardless of your race or ethnicity or income level, can have access to trails in your community and not have to drive, you know, 20, 30 minutes to get to a trail. Next slide. Just some information about education and income that was asked during the survey. We highly educated, pretty high income. You know, we have a pretty low cost of living here, so we thought that was you know, useful information to understand how people are using the trail. Next slide, please. And then just real quickly, I'll run through the COVID-19 impact on trail use. This is looking at raw data, comparing the first 6 months of 2020 to last year. And Dearborn Trail, a rural trail, almost double the increase from the previous year. And you can see in March there at the beginning of the pandemic, a little over double for that month. Next slide. Another more suburban trail, Great Miami River Trail, again, almost double during that first month of the pandemic, triple the trail usage. So these were all good signs that people were using the trail. Little Miami Scenic Trail, we had some issues with our counter there, but comparing the complete days that we had in 2020 to 2019, we saw a 42% increase, and we believe that to be you know, a very conservative estimate. We think that it was up considerably compared to the previous year, because it's one of our most popular trails in the region. Next slide. The Ohio River Trail at Lunken Airport, this is a loop trail that's really heavily used, and it was up only about 20%. And we think that that was because of our messaging, trying to encourage people to not go to busy trails during the pandemic to avoid getting in contact with other people. So even though that was maybe not as steep of an increase as some of the other trails, we think that that's still good information to know that people are heeding caution and still trying to get out on the trail. Next slide. What was perhaps the most surprising, but also not so surprising, was that our most heavily used trail in the region, the Purple People Bridge, was down throughout the pandemic. And from a volume perspective, it's still the highest used trail in our region, but it is in our urban core. It's used for people to walk to events. It's used for people to commute to work. People are not commuting to work the same way. All of the events downtown have been canceled. So overall, you know, we've seen a 10% decrease. But again, it's just useful information to understand how people are using our trail network. Next slide, please. And then overall, we have about a 10% increase from 2019 to 2020. Next slide. So just some key highlights. You don't always have to plan everything out as detailed as we did. Counting, setting up some counters is a great starting point, just so you can have that data. But if you want to build a comprehensive plan system, then it took us a lot of time, and we made some mistakes, and we learned from those mistakes. But we found that having this data is really critical to being able to tell the story and leverage future investment. And it's been really useful to get buy-in from our regional partners in that process. So if you want to learn more, next slide has a link for where you can download the reports from this program and from 2017. And if you have any questions, there's my email. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Wade. Wonderful. It's been so good to see the evolution of the entire project. Thank you. Sherry.
Great, thank you, Eric. I'll be reporting on the San Diego State of Cycling. This is some work that is just about finished and is summarizing some of the data that we've been collecting in San Diego. Next. So our program started in 2011 with funds from County of San Diego Health and Human Services Agency. They won a grant from the Center for Disease Control and used some of that funding to purchase counting equipment. SDSU was brought on, and myself as faculty there, we were brought on to this grant to identify the technology and to develop a siting strategy, and then to oversee the installation of the equipment. So we had funds to launch this counting program, but we didn't have funds for ongoing maintenance, which is quite significant. Next. We used EcoCounter. I would give a shout out to EcoCounter technology. I think they're, just very broadly dispersed, applied counting technology, and we've had that in our region since 2011. Using 3 different methods of counting: inductive loops, pyro, infrared, and eco-multi. Next. In-street counting. It's one of the main technologies that can do in-street counting using the inductive loop. Next. Image of the San Diego regional, the San Diego River bike path with an eco-multi that's counting peds and cyclists. Next. So we're counting in 32 different locations. It covers 12 different cities in San Diego County. Here's a listing. The facility type varies between Class 1 multi-use path, Class 2 in-street bike lane, and bike route, which is just a signed facility. And so we're a little different. We're not all trails, but have quite a bit of urban counting happening. Go ahead. All of our count sites are located on Sandeg's regional bike network. And so there's a regional bike network consisting of about 530 miles. And many of the connections are planned unbuilt at this point. We use this network to, in part, to guide the siting of our counting program. So the idea is over time, as this network is built out, that we'll have before-after data similar to what Wade mentioned in his presentation. So in our San Diego State of Cycling, we're reporting on change in infrastructure, change in demand, and change in collisions over time, roughly 3 to 4 year period. Next. If you look at the existing infrastructure in San Diego, we're predominantly bike lane, followed by in-street bike routes, and then a small percentage of multi-use bike path. So it's important to kind of keep this in mind as we look at change in demand, but we are largely, paint in the travelway and not very much protected facility, such as would be provided by multi-use paths. Next. If we look at the change in infrastructure, we've experienced an overall 14% increase in infrastructure, bike infrastructure from 2015 to 2018. And the majority of the miles were added as bike lanes, followed by bike route, and then a smaller percentage, the smallest percentage added to Class 1 multi-use path. So as we're growing our network, it's largely bike lane and bike route. Then reporting on some of the trends that we're seeing, so changes in demand. If we look, we're looking here at average daily bike volumes from 2013 to 2017. The color coding reflects the facility type. So green is bike route, orange is multi-use path, and blue is bike lane. So follow that symbology across the report. What are we seeing? The importance of counting over time first helps us understand the magnitude of cycling. And so, you know, are there 10 people out there? Are there 100 people out there? Well, on average, in the North region, these 11 sites, we're seeing a high of about 800 average daily bike volumes to a low of around 50 average daily bike volumes. So it helps us understand the magnitude of cycling in this area, which is important, but it also is showing us something fairly disturbing but important, which is that the trend in cycling is going down. And so we're seeing decreases in cycling here at these 11 sites. If you go to the next slide, at these 11 sites, all but one are showing declines in cycling since 2015. And you can see the single green dot in the middle is in the city of San Marcos on an inland rail trail, in fact. So it's a rail trail that saw a 10% increase, but the color coding, red decrease, green increase, we're showing declines in cycling. Next. In the central region, the story is the same, seeing similar magnitudes of cycling. So between 800 and maybe down to about 20 average daily cyclists. And so we're understanding the magnitude at these 15 sites in the central region and a similar decline in cycling over this time period. Next. A better visual of these locations that are showing declines. These in the bottom left is our downtown. Sandeg's making quite a bit of investment, although from the 15 to 17 period, the infrastructure hadn't yet been built, but we're hoping that as protected facility gets built in the downtown region, that we'd see a different type of pattern or trend over time. Next. And then finally in the South, interestingly kind of held its own, showed some increases even over this period with these 5 sites. 3 of them showed slight increases. And the magnitude, we have some of our highest counters or highest levels of activity here in the Coronado area, the city of Coronado, average daily cycling between 1,000 and 1,200. So understanding differences in magnitude of cycling across the region is important, and understanding what those numbers are is pretty important. So here showed a 14% increase in Coronado. Next. We also looked at density, average daily cycling by neighborhood density, and generally some of the lower density neighborhoods showing higher volumes, so around 500 average daily cyclists on the weekend in low density neighborhoods compared to something like 375 average daily cyclists at our count sites in high density neighborhoods. Next. More cycling in high income neighborhoods. So we aggregated all the higher income neighborhood or count locations that we had in high income, and showing some similar trends as to what Wade was finding in his study area, that, you know, higher socioeconomic characteristics associated with cycling. Next. So what are we saying here? Some concluding remarks that between 2013-17, the trend in cycling is going in the wrong direction. And if we are trying to think about a story to tell, I think the story here is that if we're building bike lanes, bike routes, we're not going to be incentivizing people to ride. We're making large investments in paint and signage. It's not going to shift modes. What we really need is a dense network of separated facility, multi-use paths, or cycle track that would motivate changes in behavior. Next. It's especially disturbing to see the trends in vehicle miles traveled kind of crossing through 2015. That combined with declines in cycling really is a wake-up call for policymakers. I mean, I think this data is incredibly powerful to say, we're not doing enough. We're not doing enough to shift travel mode. Okay. Next. We could really make the case we need more equal funding by mode. We need equal quality and capacity by mode, and even suppress the capacity for automobile travel if we really want to see travel trends change. Next. And in San Diego, if we're providing complete streets, we could make an argument that this is a complete street. It's providing for driving, transit. There is a bike lane here and a pedestrian walkway as well. If these are our complete streets, we're not going to induce travel mode change. So we need to be doing something different. I think that's the message of this data. Next. Next. Great, thank you. Quick, made it. I caught up for time.
So much, Sherry.
Mm-hmm.
A few resources here, and if you haven't been looking, please do look before we get into the Q&A in the chat box on the right side in your control panel. There's been an ongoing list of resource links there, so you'll find a plethora of links to Wade's work, Sherry's work, RTC's work and resources. So please take a peek there. I want to jump into questions. We have had way more and some fabulous questions. Thank you, everybody. And we can't get to them all, but we will do our best. The first one I want to throw out to the whole panel, if someone feels strongly to jump in, the differentiation between a user count and traffic monitoring, the nomenclature seems to be used interchangeably, but I think it's really important to to let this audience understand the difference. Traffic monitoring is not a user count. Would someone like to tackle the differentiation?
Yeah, I can tackle that. So one of our partners, the Friends of Little Miami State Park, they have been collecting this data that is specifically trail user counts. So when they collect their data, they make an estimate that like 95% of trail users are going out and back. And so they divide their data in half. And you know, that lowers the number that we're reporting out to the world. The data that we're reporting on, average annual daily trail traffic and trail miles traveled, is more representative of how people are using it, including the out and back. So that even though maybe they park at a trailhead and ride 20 miles, or 10 miles out, 10 miles back, and we're collecting that data point twice, it's showing that, you know, somebody's using the trail twice. And I think that it's particularly relevant for commuting patterns to be able to understand and compare trail and bike and pedestrian usage to the same way that traffic engineers are doing roadway planning. And I think if we want to compete for the same resources as roads and bridges are getting, you know, we have to speak the same language. And so that's why, you know, we typically lean towards the trail traffic metrics.
Thank you, Wade. Yeah, and I love that last point. It really is using the same way to discuss our data as road engineers do, and it's about volume data. It's user data is different, and if you want to better understand what the number of what that traffic number means, you mentioned it in your presentation, Wade. Torsha, you've mentioned it as well. You know, what are a couple tactics if you want to take the traffic number, and better understand the user? What are a couple tactics people can use to flesh out their data collection and better understand the user?
I can answer the first part. One of the things that you could do is do some spot surveys to know more about what's behind those numbers in terms of demographics, because you don't get those information. What kind of racial or gender how can you break down your data in terms of different ways that you look at, in terms of where these people are coming from. Even if you're looking at local spending impact of trails, that helps because you're asking them where they're spending money, but then it helps to know where they're coming from, how much income, what's their household income, race, education, all of the other related demographics. That always adds an additional lens.
I would also add that I would also add in terms of the distinction between users and traffic monitoring. I mean, you saw in our presentation, especially Wade and myself, that we're counting at a particular location, a fixed location. So we're counting the people going by that fixed location. So it's more a function of the facility and who's on that facility at a point in time, versus users is counting, you know, could be tracking people in a whole bunch of different contexts. I think the important thing is to be very clear about the units of your data, and you know, but when we're counting at a fixed location, and so we just, it's who's going back and forth at that location.
Absolutely. It's a question about technologies. Someone asked very specifically if anyone has experience with geolocation analytics like streetlight or Strava data to assess use. Any experience with that, and any comparison with the more traditional automated counters that were more focused today?
I mean, the Strava data provides routes or lines, and so again, we're measuring at a fixed location when we do these counts, measuring at a fixed location versus collecting routes that people take, line traces that people take. So you can aggregate up these line traces and kind of consider that a sample that would get you to some understanding of demand for sure. But it's just different data. It's different data. It's not a measurement at a fixed location, which is what we're all presenting on.
We at RTC, we have actually collaborated with Strava and used some of the data to look at what kind of impact gap closing in trails have on trail usage. So that has been very helpful to show us when you close a gap, construct that small section, how it actually magnifies the total usage. So that has been helpful.
Yeah, and one thing to build on that, you know, Strava is limited to folks who have access to a Strava collecting GPS device. So, you know, I think there's some biases in how that data is representing all of traffic, trail traffic or road cycling usage. So it's just, you know, not that that's necessarily a bad thing. It's just something to note that you're missing people when you're using Strava data. And about streetlight, I've heard in Columbus, Ohio, that they have compared the streetlight data to their fixed trail monitoring locations and have found the numbers to be comparable. I haven't actually looked at that data myself, but it's another tool that you can reference.
Yeah, and for most of these, they have a correcting factor that you need to take into account.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I had a question here come in from the RTC National Database. We talked a lot about the different technologies, whether it's EcoCounter, traffic counters, different technologies. People were asking whether it matters what technology they use to share their data with RTC for that national database. That's right to you, Torsha.
So basically what I think is the more we collect, the better. But I also, in terms of representing it, just because we want to make sure it's apples to apples, we would prefer having a similar platform. If not, at least we would like to QC the data before publishing it online. If they're all using the same technology, it's easier for us to do that. If it's different technology, that might need a conscious effort on our part to get that data before we funnel it out to the public.
Great.
But bring it on.
Question about security. Experience with different technologies and security, vandalism, those issues with the types of counters that you have used. And that's an open question to anybody on the panel that would like to answer.
We've, with our 32 sites, and being there almost 9 years now, we've had probably about 5 instances of vandalism. So it's not that prevalent. But I would definitely say the urban post that EcoCounter has is much better and much more durable than the wooden post, and much less vulnerable to vandalism. So we're switching all our wooden posts to urban posts, but not too bad.
Yeah, we've had one instance of vandalism, and fortunately the counter just ended up on the ground. You know, we assume it was a person, but we always try to place them discreetly. And even though we're really proud of this program and like to share the data from it, we never tell people where our counters are through our social media, just because we don't want to draw attention to them.
Absolutely. Great. I think we've probably got time for one more. It looks like we only have a couple minutes. And I want to ask this question knowing that it might take more than a minute or two, but I really do want to get it in. Can anyone speak to error correction or quality assurance? You know, how are you going about the outliers and the missing data? You know, what are some strategies around validation and you know, factoring and quality assurance? Nobody wants to try to do that in 2 minutes.
Well, you have to be looking at the data, you know, daily, weekly, because you will see problems coming through. And once you see a problem coming through, you need to figure it out. The San Diego network suffered from not having enough staff or funding to do that all the time. So we do have gaps in our data, but there are pretty good published methods for factoring missing data, for extrapolating missing data. So you can go to the research and find methods for doing that. But you do need to pay attention to missing data, to erroneous data. Sandag in my region has done some 24-hour video counts to do validation. And I want to say, you know, that they're fairly accurate. The eco-counting technology is fairly accurate, but it's worthwhile to do a validation and figure out what correction factors are. If anything, they tend to undercount, especially the in-street counting. So if the cyclist doesn't go over the loop, then you're missing that cyclist. So there is a bit of undercounting, but you know, with all data collection, there's some error in that we try to focus in on the error of counting bikes and peds, but what about the error counting vehicles? That happens as well, and we don't pay attention.
And also sometimes knowing whether there was a special event or something that might look like an outlier, but actually it is a proper count. So it might be a false negative too.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. Don't undervalue how much your trail and active transportation network is being used, you know, special events. And I'm going to wrap up here. We're at 2 o'clock, but I do hear that a lot from people that are using counters or setting up a count program, and they're concerned about special events or big activities happening. And the concern is, well, are we overinflating what's actually happening? And I really do think it's important that's actually happening. That if it is people on your facility, it's the capacity for your community to have major events, and the fact that your trail and active transportation system is helping facilitate that. It's beyond valid. It's vital to show that. So do not be embarrassed about unbelievably high counts that are real. That's a wonderful thing. Thank you everybody for tuning in today. Thank you so much, Sherry, Wade, Torsha. That was fabulous. Thank you to all 3 of you. That was fabulous. This could have been 2 hours long easily. We really appreciate your time, everyone that tuned in to this Trail Expert Network webinar. And we look forward to seeing everybody again next time.
Thank you.